Story 1. The Way Station That Weighs Souls. Marcus Webb had been hauling freight across the American heartland for 23 years, building a reputation as one of the most dependable drivers in the regional network. He specialized in agricultural transport, moving grain, livestock feed, and farming equipment between the vast prairies of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas. At 48 years old, Marcus knew every back road and shortcut in the region, every way station and inspection point, every truck stop where the coffee was good and the mechanics were honest. He drove a dark blue 2018 Kenworth T680, a truck he'd purchased outright after years of working for fleet companies, finally achieving his dream of being an independent owner-operator. On July 19, 2021, Marcus picked up a load of corn from a grain elevator outside of Salina, Kansas, destined for an ethanol processing plant near Sioux Falls, South Dakota. It was a routine haul, one he'd made dozens of times before. The weather was perfect, clear summer skies with temperatures in the low 80s, ideal conditions for a peaceful drive through the endless fields of wheat and corn that characterized this part of America. He loaded 53,000 pounds of grain, checked his paperwork, inspected his trailer seals, and departed at 3 in the afternoon, planning to arrive by late evening. The first 2 hours passed in comfortable routine. Marcus listened to a podcast about American history, occasionally switching to his CB radio to chat with other drivers about traffic conditions and road hazards. The highway stretched before him in long, straight segments, the landscape flat and predictable. He passed through small towns with grain elevators rising like sentinels against the horizon, past farmhouses and fields that rolled on for miles without interruption. Around 5:30 p.m., somewhere on Highway 81 between Concordia and Belleville, Marcus saw signs for a way station ahead. This surprised him slightly because he didn't recall a way station at this location. He'd driven this route countless times and thought he knew every official checkpoint, but the signs were professional and official-looking. Standard Department of Transportation design with reflective lettering. All commercial vehicles must enter. Way station 2 miles. Marcus checked his logbook and documents, making sure everything was in order. He wasn't concerned. His truck was properly registered, his load was legal weight, and his paperwork was immaculate. He maintained his equipment to the highest standards and had never received a citation in 23 years of driving. Way stations were a routine part of the job, nothing to worry about. The way station appeared ahead, set back from the highway in a clearing surrounded by cornfields. The facility looked older than most modern stations, with architecture that seemed to date from the 1960s or 70s. Concrete block buildings painted institutional gray, older-style scales and lighting fixtures that looked vintage rather than contemporary. But it was clearly operational, with signs lit up and lane markers freshly painted. Marcus took the exit ramp and followed the arrows toward the scale. There were no other trucks in sight, which was unusual for a summer evening when agricultural transport was typically busy. The station appeared to be staffed, with lights on in the main building and a uniformed officer visible in the scale house. Marcus pulled onto the scale platform and set his parking brake, waiting for the weight reading and the signal to proceed. The officer emerged from the scale house and approached Marcus's truck. He wore what appeared to be a standard DOT uniform, but something about it seemed off. The patches on his shoulders were slightly wrong, the insignia not quite matching any state or federal design Marcus recognized. The officer's face was difficult to see clearly despite the bright overhead lights, his features somehow blurred or indistinct. "Shut down your engine and step out of the vehicle," the officer said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Bring all documentation. You're selected for comprehensive inspection." Marcus complied, gathering his papers and climbing down from his cab. The evening air felt wrong, colder than it should have been for July, with a quality of stillness that was oppressive rather than peaceful. No birds sang in the surrounding fields. No insects buzzed in the grass. The silence was total except for the hum of electrical equipment. "Follow me to the inspection building," the officer said, turning and walking toward one of the concrete structures without waiting for a response. Marcus followed, his unease growing with each step. He noticed that the officer cast no shadow despite the bright overhead lights, and his footsteps made no sound on the concrete. Inside, the building was sparse and cold. A metal desk sat in the center of a small room with 2 chairs and walls covered in regulation posters that looked authentic at first glance but revealed themselves to be wrong when examined closely. The text on the posters was slightly garbled, words in the wrong order, regulations that made no sense. The officer sat behind the desk and gestured for Marcus to sit opposite him. "Marcus Webb," the officer said, reading from a clipboard that Marcus hadn't seen him carrying. "Age 48, 23 years commercial driving experience. 4 previous marriages, 3 children from various relationships. 2 DUI arrests in your 20s before you became a truck driver. 1 incident of domestic violence, charges dropped. Multiple instances of infidelity, estranged from your oldest daughter who refuses to speak to you. Significant debt from poor financial decisions. Regular attendance at church where you present yourself as a reformed man but persistent. Patterns of dishonesty and selfishness in your personal relationships." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. "What the hell is this? How do you know these things? This has nothing to do with a vehicle inspection." "This is not a vehicle inspection," the officer said, his blurred features seeming to sharpen slightly, becoming more distinct and far less human. "This is a comprehensive weight assessment. We measure what drivers carry, not just their cargo. We weigh their choices, their regrets, their sins, their secrets. Every driver who enters this station is evaluated on the full weight they bear." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. "This is insane. I'm leaving." He turned toward the door, but it had vanished. Where the entrance had been, there was now only a solid concrete wall, as if the door had never existed. Marcus pounded on the wall, his fists making dull thuds against the unyielding surface. "Let me out! You can't keep me here!" "Your vehicle weight is 53,000 pounds, the officer continued, ignoring Marcus's panic. "Legal and acceptable, but your soul weight is significantly over limit. You carry guilt from the daughter you abandoned, shame from the wives you betrayed, fear of the man you really are beneath the facade you present to the world, anger at yourself for repeatedly making the same mistakes. The cumulative weight of your spiritual and emotional cargo exceeds acceptable parameters. You are in violation." Marcus turned back to face the officer, his breathing ragged. "What do you want from me? What is this place?" "This is a checkpoint," the officer said. "We exist at intervals along certain highways, appearing to drivers who carry excessive spiritual weight. Most drivers never see us. They pass through this location and perceive only empty road. But those like you, those carrying burdens that exceed their capacity, are drawn to this station. Your soul needs to be weighed, evaluated, and either cleared for passage or detained for recalibration." "Recalibration?" Marcus whispered. "What does that mean?" "It means you stay here until you've processed your cargo," the officer said. "Until you've confronted what you carry, acknowledged it, accepted it, found a way to reduce the weight. Some drivers are here for hours, some for days. Time moves differently in this station. You'll remain until your soul weight reaches acceptable levels." The room began to change. The walls became transparent, and Marcus could see scenes from his life playing out around him like projected films. He saw himself at 23, drunk behind the wheel, narrowly avoiding killing a family in another vehicle. He saw himself walking away from his first wife, leaving her pregnant and alone because he wanted freedom. He saw his second marriage disintegrating under the weight of his lies and infidelities. He saw his daughter's face, tears streaming down as she told him she never wanted to see him again, that he'd failed her too many times. He saw himself in church singing hymns and praying, presenting an image of redemption and transformation. But then he saw the truth behind that image. The affairs continuing, the lies multiplying, the same patterns repeating despite his proclamations of change. He saw himself in mirrors, practicing expressions of sincerity, learning to manufacture authenticity while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Marcus fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of seeing his entire life laid bare, all his carefully constructed self-deceptions stripped away. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I know what I am. I know what I've done." "Acknowledgement is the first step," the officer said, "but insufficient. You must process the weight. Understand why you carry it. Decide whether to release it or continue bearing it. These are choices only you can make." The scenes continued to play out, relentless and unforgiving. Marcus watched himself hurt people, disappoint children, break promises, lie to those who trusted him. He saw the full cost of his actions, the pain he'd caused rippling outward through other lives. He saw the man he could have been, standing beside the man he'd become. The gap between them, a canyon of wasted potential and squandered opportunities. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Marcus lost track of time in that cold concrete room with his life projected on transparent walls. He was forced to witness every mistake, every moment of weakness, every choice that had led him to carry this unbearable weight. The officer sat silent and motionless, watching Marcus process decades of accumulated guilt and shame and regret. Eventually, something shifted. Marcus stopped crying and simply sat with the weight, acknowledging it without trying to excuse or justify it. He saw himself clearly for the first time in years, maybe in his entire life. He was flawed, broken in many ways, responsible for significant pain. But he was also human, capable of change even if he'd failed to change before. The weight didn't disappear, but it became bearable, something he could carry without being crushed by it. "I can't undo what I've done," Marcus said quietly. "I can't go back and be the father I should have been, the husband I should have been. But I can try to do better. I can stop lying, at least to myself. I can stop pretending I'm something I'm not. I can carry this weight honestly instead of hiding from it." The officer nodded slowly. "Your soul weight has reached acceptable parameters. Not eliminated, but managed, acknowledged rather than denied. You may proceed." The walls became solid concrete again. A door appeared where none had been, opening to reveal the evening light outside. Marcus stood on shaking legs and walked toward the exit. He turned back to look at the officer one more time. "Will I come back here?" Marcus asked. "If I fall back into old patterns, will I see this station again?" "Possibly," the officer said. "Or you might see other stations, other checkpoints. There are many places where souls are weighed, many opportunities for evaluation and recalibration. Whether you return depends on the choices you make, the weight you allow yourself to accumulate." Marcus walked out into the evening air, which now felt normal, warm and pleasant with the sounds of crickets and a distant meadowlark. His truck sat on the scale where he'd left it, engine off, exactly as it had been. He climbed into his cab and checked the clock. 5:45 p.m., only 15 minutes after he'd pulled into the way station. 15 minutes that had felt like days. He started his engine and pulled forward, exiting the way station and merging back onto the highway. In his rearview mirror, he watched the facility recede into the distance. Then he blinked, and it was gone. Not just behind him, but absent entirely. The highway shoulder was empty, no buildings, no signs, no indication that a way station had ever existed at that location. Marcus completed his delivery to Sioux Falls, unloading his corn and accepting his payment. But he was fundamentally changed by what he'd experienced. He called his oldest daughter that night, something he hadn't done in 3 years. She didn't answer, but he left a message. A real message, not the usual empty pleasantries and excuses. He told her he understood why she'd cut contact, that he didn't deserve her forgiveness, but that he wanted her to know he finally saw himself clearly. He didn't expect a response, and he didn't receive one. But making the call was important, not for her, but for himself. It was a beginning. Over the following months, Marcus made changes. He stopped attending church where he'd been performing righteousness rather than practicing it. He sought actual therapy instead of just talking about his problems without addressing them. He reached out to his ex-wives, not asking for reconciliation or forgiveness, but offering genuine apologies and taking responsibility for his failures. Most didn't respond, and he accepted that. The point wasn't to be absolved, but to acknowledge the truth. He never found that way station again, though he looked for it on subsequent runs through Kansas. Other drivers had no knowledge of it. State transportation records showed no official facility at that location, no plans for one, no history of one ever existing. But Marcus knows what he experienced. He was stopped at a checkpoint that doesn't appear on any map, where souls are weighed instead of trucks, where drivers carrying excessive spiritual cargo are forced to confront what they've been avoiding. He drives differently now, with less confidence and more humility. He knows he carries weight beyond his cargo, burdens that can't be unloaded at a delivery dock. He monitors his soul weight the way he monitors his truck's gauges, alert for warnings that he's accumulating too much, that he's falling back into old patterns. He's not a redeemed man, not transformed, not saved. He's just a flawed human trying to manage his weight honestly, to carry his burdens without being crushed by them. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, Marcus sees other trucks pulled into facilities that shimmer at the edges of visibility. Drivers being evaluated at checkpoints that exist in dimensions beside the physical. He wonders what weights they carry, what truths they're being forced to confront. He wonders if they'll emerge lighter or remain trapped in recalibration indefinitely. He wonders how many drivers are hauling cargo they don't acknowledge, overweight souls hidden beneath legal loads. Marcus Webb is 48 years old with 23 years of commercial driving experience. He hauls grain across the heartland, making his routes, earning his living. But he knows now that every driver is carrying more than what's listed on their manifest, that the weight of choices and regrets and accumulated guilt travels with them mile after mile. He knows that somewhere out there way stations exist that measure what really matters, that evaluate the burdens invisible to normal scales. And he knows that being allowed to proceed doesn't mean being forgiven, just that your weight has been acknowledged, that you've stopped denying what you carry. The roads go on, the cargo continues to accumulate, and the checkpoints wait for those who've exceeded their capacity, ready to force another reckoning, another evaluation, another chance to confront the weight of a lifetime. Story 2. The Convoy of the Disappeared. Patricia Donovan had been driving cross-country routes for 16 years, one of the growing number of women succeeding in an industry that had been predominantly male for most of its history. She took pride in breaking stereotypes, proving through consistent performance and professionalism that gender had nothing to do with ability to handle long hauls and heavy equipment. At 41 years old, Patricia was known among dispatchers and logistics coordinators as someone who always delivered on time, maintained her equipment impeccably, and never complained about difficult assignments. She drove a red 2020 International LT series, customized with upgraded suspension and a comfortable sleeper cab configured for extended time on the road. On October 7, 2020, Patricia accepted a high-priority load from a defense contractor in Virginia, destined for a military installation near 29 Palms, California. The cargo was classified, which wasn't unusual for military contracts. Her trailer was loaded and sealed by security personnel, and she was instructed not to open it under any circumstances. The manifest simply listed government property with a weight of 42,000 pounds. Patricia had hauled similar loads before and knew the protocol. Drive directly to the destination, avoid unnecessary stops, report any suspicious activity or attempted interference immediately. She departed Virginia at midnight, planning to drive for 11 hours, rest, then continue in a pattern that would get her to California in 4 days. The pay was excellent, and the route was straightforward, mostly interstate highways across the southern tier of the country. Patricia settled into her driving rhythm, watching the darkness flow past her windows, occasionally communicating with other drivers on the CB radio about weather conditions and traffic. The first 2 days passed without incident. Patricia made her scheduled rest stops, maintained her logbook precisely, and crossed from Virginia through Tennessee, Arkansas, and into Texas. By the evening of the second day, she was approaching the vast emptiness of West Texas, that desolate stretch of Interstate 10 where civilization becomes sparse and the landscape transforms into something almost alien in its barrenness. Around 9 p.m., somewhere between Fort Stockton and Van Horn, Patricia noticed other trucks falling in around her. It started with one semi appearing in her mirrors, maintaining a steady distance behind her. Then another joined from an on-ramp, pulling ahead of her. 2 more appeared from side roads Patricia hadn't even noticed, taking positions on either side when the highway widened to multiple lanes. Within 20 minutes, Patricia found herself in the middle of a convoy of 7 trucks, all moving in precise formation. She tried to get a better look at the other vehicles. They were older models, mostly from the 1980s and 90s, but maintained in pristine condition. No company logos were visible, no identifying marks, just plain semi-trucks in various colors driving in synchronized formation. Patricia attempted to change lanes, thinking she'd drop back and let the convoy pass, but when she turned her steering wheel, her truck didn't respond. She tried again, pulling harder, but the wheel was locked in position, holding her perfectly centered in her lane. Panic began to rise in her chest. Patricia pressed her brakes, but they didn't engage. She tried to accelerate, but her throttle was unresponsive. Her truck was maintaining exactly 65 miles per hour, matching the speed of the convoy, controlled by something other than her input. She was trapped in formation, surrounded by trucks that moved with mechanical precision. Patricia grabbed her CB radio. "This is Patricia Donovan in the Red International. I've lost control of my vehicle. Can anyone hear me? I need assistance." Static answered her. She tried different channels, cycling through frequencies, but every channel was dead, just hiss and crackle with no voices breaking through. She reached for her cell phone, thinking she'd call Highway Patrol. The screen was black, completely unresponsive. She tried to power it on, but nothing happened. All her communication devices were dead, and her truck was driving itself in a convoy of autonomous vehicles heading west through the Texas darkness. The convoy continued for hours. Patricia sat in her driver's seat, hands hovering uselessly over controls that wouldn't respond, watching the highway unspool before her in long, straight segments. The other trucks never deviated, never adjusted speed, never broke formation. They moved as a single entity, 7 vehicles locked in perfect synchronization. Around midnight, the convoy took an exit Patricia didn't remember seeing before. The off-ramp led to a 2-lane highway that headed north into absolute darkness, away from the interstate, into terrain that appeared completely uninhabited. Patricia checked her GPS, but the screen showed static, no map data, just visual noise. She had no idea where she was or where this convoy was taking her. The two-lane highway wound through increasingly rough terrain. Rock formations appeared in her headlights, strange geological structures that looked like melted stone or petrified wood on an enormous scale. The landscape became otherworldly, like something from another planet rather than West Texas. And ahead, lights appeared, a massive facility sprawling across the desert floor, illuminated by industrial lighting that created harsh shadows and pools of brightness. The convoy approached a gate in a high fence that surrounded the facility. The gate opened automatically and the trucks drove through without slowing. Patricia could see guard towers, though no guards were visible, and multiple warehouse buildings arranged in a grid pattern. The facility looked military or governmental, but there were no flags, no identifying markers, no signs indicating what this place was or who operated it. The convoy split up, each truck heading to a specific building. Patricia's truck steered itself toward a loading dock at Warehouse 7, backing up with precision that would have been impressive if it weren't terrifying. Her trailer connected with the dock and her engine shut off. All her lights extinguished, leaving her in darkness broken only by the harsh industrial lighting visible through her windshield. Patricia sat frozen, unsure what to do. Should she stay in her truck? Should she get out and try to find someone in authority? Should she attempt to run to escape from whatever this place was? Before she could decide, figures appeared outside her truck, surrounding it. They wore black uniforms with no insignia, faces covered by balaclavas, moving with military efficiency. One of them climbed onto her running board and knocked on her window with gloved knuckles. Patricia rolled down the window, her hand shaking. The figure leaned close, and she could see eyes behind the balaclava, human eyes that looked tired and sad. "You're not supposed to be here," the figure said, voice muffled by the fabric covering his face. "You're hauling a classified load, but you're not one of the regular drivers. Someone made a mistake assigning you this route. This convoy is for drivers who've been recruited. You're still civilian. You shouldn't have been brought to this location." "Where am I?" Patricia managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" "Classified facility," the figure said. "We move materials that don't exist according to official records. We use drivers who've agreed to work outside normal logistics networks, hauling cargo between locations that aren't on any map. The convoy system ensures that these drivers can be monitored and controlled, but you're not supposed to be part of this. Your load was meant for a regular driver in the program." "What happens now?" Patricia asked, terrified of the answer. The figure was silent for a moment, then spoke quietly. "Normally, drivers who see this facility are recruited permanently or detained indefinitely. You've seen too much. You know this place exists. That's a security problem. But because the mistake was ours, because we pulled you into the convoy when you should have been allowed to continue on normal highways, we're giving you a choice." "What choice?" "Join the program voluntarily. Your life as you know it ends. You'll haul classified loads on routes that don't appear on maps, earn very good money but never return to normal civilian life. You'll live in a facility like this one, drive when assigned, exist outside official records. Or we release you with modified memories. You'll complete your delivery to 29 Palms with no recollection of this detour. You'll remember driving straight through Texas without incident. This night will be erased from your mind." Patricia's thoughts raced. Join a shadow logistics network and lose her freedom, or have her memory altered and return to normal life. The choice was impossible, both options terrifying in different ways. What if I refuse both? What if I demand to be released with my memories intact? The figure shook his head slowly. "That's not an option. You've seen a classified facility. The information in your head is a security risk. One way or another, that risk has to be neutralized. Memory modification is the humane option. The alternative is permanent detention. You'd spend the rest of your life in a holding facility, comfortable but isolated, never seeing your family or friends again. Tears streamed down Patricia's face. This was a nightmare beyond anything she'd imagined. She'd accepted a routine military contract and ended up trapped in some Black Ops logistics program, forced to choose between versions of captivity. Will the memory modification hurt? Will I be me, or will I be someone different? You'll be exactly yourself, the figure said, just without the memories of this facility and the convoy. The process is sophisticated. It doesn't damage cognition or personality, just removes specific memories and fills the gap with plausible alternatives. You'll remember driving through Texas, stopping for fuel, continuing to your destination. Everything else stays intact. Patricia closed her eyes, making a decision she never wanted to make. Modify my memories. I want to go home eventually. I want my life back, even if I won't remember this happened. The figure nodded. Understandable. Most drivers make the same choice. Come with me. The process takes about 2 hours, and then you'll be back on the highway like none of this ever happened. Patricia was escorted to a medical facility within the complex. A sterile room with equipment that looked like a combination of MRI machines and something else, technology she didn't recognize. Technicians in white coats explained the procedure in clinical terms, talking about neural pattern modification and memory engram removal. Patricia only half understood, too frightened and overwhelmed to process the technical details. They sedated her lightly, not unconsciousness, but a dreamy state where she was aware but detached. She felt the machines working, sensations of pressure in her head, odd tingles along her scalp. She tried to hold on to the memories of the convoy and the facility, knowing they were about to be erased, wanting to remember even though she'd chosen to forget. But the memories became slippery, fading like dreams upon waking. Details evaporating even as she tried to grasp them. When the procedure ended, Patricia felt groggy and disoriented. The technicians helped her sit up, gave her water, monitored her vital signs. After about 30 minutes, the grogginess faded, and she felt normal again. One of the masked figures from before entered the room. "How do you feel?" the figure asked. "Fine, I think," Patricia said. "A little tired. What time is it?" 2 a.m. You've been here for 3 hours. Do you remember arriving at this facility? Patricia frowned, trying to recall. I'm not sure. I remember driving through Texas. I think I stopped for fuel somewhere around Fort Stockton. Then I kept driving. I don't remember arriving anywhere. Where is this? What facility? The figure nodded, satisfied. This is a rest area medical station. You called in feeling unwell, possibly food poisoning from dinner. We had you stop here so our medical team could check you out. You're fine, just mild dehydration. We've given you fluids and cleared you to continue your route. Your truck is fueled and ready. You should arrive at 29 Palms on schedule. Patricia accepted this explanation without question. It made sense, fit with her fragmented memories of the evening. She thanked the medical team and walked back to her truck. It was parked at what appeared to be a standard rest area, well lit and maintained. She climbed into her cab, started her engine, and pulled back onto the highway, continuing west toward California. She completed her delivery to 29 Palms without further incident, unloading her classified cargo under the supervision of military personnel. The return trip was uneventful. Patricia returned home to her family, took a week off, and then accepted her next assignment. Life continued normally, the October 7th convoy completely erased from her memory. But something remained. Patricia began experiencing strange dreams. fragmented images that made no sense. Trucks driving in perfect formation through darkness, facilities with harsh lighting and warehouses, figures in black uniforms with covered faces. She'd wake from these dreams with a feeling of unease, a sense that something important had been forgotten. But when she tried to remember, there was nothing there, just empty space where memories should be. She also developed new habits that puzzled her. She became extremely cautious about accepting military contracts, often turning them down even when the pay was excellent. She avoided driving through West Texas at night, rerouting to add hours to her trips rather than taking the direct path across that desolate landscape. When other drivers mentioned seeing convoys of unmarked trucks moving in formation, Patricia felt her heart race with inexplicable anxiety. 6 months after the incident she couldn't remember, Patricia was at a truck stop in New Mexico when she overheard two drivers talking. "Did you hear about Angela Martinez? She accepted a military load from Virginia and disappeared. She was supposed to deliver to California, but she never arrived. Her truck vanished somewhere in Texas. State police found no trace, no accident, nothing. It's like she drove off the face of the earth." Patricia felt a chill run through her body. Virginia to California. The same route she'd driven in October. Disappeared in Texas. Exactly where her fragmented dreams were set. She approached the two drivers. "When did this happen? When did Angela disappear?" "About 3 weeks ago," one of the drivers said. "Her family is frantic. The company hired private investigators, but there's nothing to find. She just vanished." Patricia returned to her truck and sat in her cab, her hands trembling. She pulled out her logbook and flipped back to October 7, 2020. Her entries for that date showed steady progress across Texas, fuel stops at normal intervals, everything routine and unremarkable. But the entries felt wrong somehow, as if they'd been written by someone else, as if she was reading a story about her trip rather than her actual memories. She tried to remember that night, really remember it, pushing past the smooth narrative her mind presented. And for just a moment she saw something else. Trucks in formation, a facility in the desert, a choice between memory, modification, and permanent recruitment. Then the vision faded, and she was left with only the official story again, the sanitized version that had been installed in her mind. Patricia never told anyone about her fragmented dreams or her moment of breakthrough memory. She didn't think anyone would believe her, and part of her didn't believe herself. But she became cautious in ways that other drivers noticed, turning down certain loads, avoiding specific routes, asking more questions about cargo and destinations before accepting assignments. And she started keeping a private journal, documenting her dreams, recording every fragmented image and sensation. She noted patterns, times when the dreams were more vivid, routes that triggered stronger feelings of unease. She was trying to reconstruct what had been taken from her, piecing together a truth that had been surgically removed from her consciousness. Patricia Donovan is 41 years old with 16 years of commercial driving experience. She hauls freight across America, earning her living on the highways. But she knows, in a way she can't quite articulate, that something was taken from her. She knows there are convoys moving through the night that serve purposes she can't remember. That there are facilities in the desert where drivers are recruited or modified or disappeared. She knows that Angela Martinez is out there somewhere, maybe driving for the Shadow Logistics Network, maybe detained, maybe gone in a way that no one will ever explain. And sometimes, late at night on empty highways, Patricia sees formations of unmarked trucks moving with mechanical precision, and she feels her steering wheel try to lock, feels her truck attempting to fall into formation with them. She fights it, grips the wheel harder, forces her truck to stay in its lane, refuses to be pulled back into whatever system she escaped from. The convoys continue without her, hauling cargo that doesn't exist to facilities that aren't on any map, driven by people who've either volunteered or been disappeared. All part of a logistics network that operates in the shadows of the official economy. Patricia drives on, carrying her fragmented memories and her incomplete knowledge. One of the lucky ones who was released instead of recruited. But she knows that luck can change, that choices can be revisited, that the shadow system is always recruiting and her name is in their database. She drives carefully, stays vigilant, and hopes that she'll never again see that exit in West Texas that leads to facilities that erase you from the world one way or another. The highways stretch on forever, and somewhere on them convoys are forming, drivers are disappearing, and the classified cargo continues to move between places that don't officially exist, hauled by people who've crossed over from the normal world into something else entirely. Story 3. The town that feeds on drivers. Roberto Alvarez had been driving for 11 years, building his career from local deliveries in Southern California to regional routes across the Southwest. He was 34 years old, married with 2 young children, and working to save money to eventually buy his own truck and become an independent operator. He drove for a mid-sized company based in Phoenix, handling their dry goods and consumer products routes. His truck was a white 2016 Volvo VNL 780, reliable and comfortable, equipped with the standard safety features and navigation systems that characterized modern commercial vehicles. On March 21, 2022, Roberto picked up a load of household goods and furniture from a distribution center in Phoenix, headed for retail stores in Flagstaff, Arizona. It was a straightforward run up Interstate 17, a route Roberto had driven dozens of times. The drive would take about 2.5 hours in normal conditions, easily completed in a morning with time to spare for his next assignment. He departed Phoenix at 6 a.m., watching the sun rise over the Sonoran Desert, the landscape still cool from the night. The first hour passed normally. Roberto climbed out of the Phoenix Basin, watching the saguaro cacti gradually give way to higher elevation vegetation as the highway wound into the mountains. He listened to morning radio, a mix of music and news, occasionally checking his mirrors and monitoring his gauges. Traffic was light, mostly commuters heading to Flagstaff and a few other commercial vehicles making similar runs. Around 7:30, Roberto noticed a highway sign he didn't recognize. Sierra Verde, next exit, food, fuel, lodging. He frowned, trying to recall if he'd ever seen this exit before. He'd driven this route so many times that he knew every town, every truck stop, every scenic overlook. Sierra Verde didn't ring any bells, but he'd been focused on other things during recent trips. Maybe he'd just never noticed it. He wasn't planning to stop, but as he approached the exit, his truck lurched violently. A loud bang came from his rear axle and the steering wheel jerked in his hands. Roberto's heart jumped into his throat as he fought to control the vehicle. He managed to guide his truck onto the shoulder, the vehicle shuddering with each rotation of the damaged wheel. He brought the rig to a stop and set his parking brake, breathing hard from the adrenaline surge. Roberto climbed out and walked to the rear of his truck. His left rear outer tire had blown catastrophically, the rubber shredded and the wheel rim damaged. He'd need a professional repair, not just a roadside tire change. He pulled out his phone to call for assistance and noticed he had no signal. That was unusual but not unprecedented in the mountains. He grabbed his CB radio microphone from his cab. "This is Roberto Alvarez at mile marker 227 on I-17 northbound. I've got a blown tire and need road service. Any drivers in the area, please relay." Static answered him. He tried several times, but the CB seemed dead. No responses, no traffic, just empty airwaves. The sign for Sierra Verde beckoned from the exit ramp ahead. Roberto decided he'd limp his truck down the exit to the town, find a phone or someone with a cell signal, and arrange for repair. He drove slowly, his damaged wheel grinding and scraping, covering the mile to the exit and then following the access road toward the town. Sierra Verde appeared ahead, nestled in a valley between pine-covered ridges. It looked like a typical small Arizona mountain town, with a main street lined with businesses, residential areas spreading up the hillsides, and the rustic architecture common to communities established in the early 20th century. Roberto saw a gas station at the edge of town and carefully maneuvered his truck into the parking area. The gas station looked operational but dated, with pumps that appeared to be from the 1970s and a small attached convenience store. A man emerged from the store as Roberto shut down his engine. He was perhaps 60 years old, wearing mechanic's coveralls and a friendly smile. "Looks like you've got some trouble there," the man said, gesturing toward Roberto's shredded tire. "That's a pretty bad blowout." "Yeah, I need to call for road service," Roberto said. "My phone's not getting signal and my CB's not working. Can I use your phone?" "Sure, come on inside," the man said. Roberto followed him into the convenience store, which was stocked with typical items but had an old-fashioned quality. Products and packaging that looked decades out of date. The man gestured to a payphone on the wall. "Help yourself." A payphone. Roberto couldn't remember the last time he'd seen one of those. He picked up the receiver and heard a dial tone. He tried to call his company's dispatch number, but when he dialed, nothing happened. The call wouldn't connect. He tried several times, different numbers, even attempted to dial 911. But no calls would go through. The phone had a dial tone but couldn't complete connections. "Sometimes the lines are funny up here in the mountains," the man said. "Tell you what, I can fix that tire for you. I've got a shop out back with commercial equipment. Take me about 2 hours, cost you $400. Cash only, I'm afraid. Don't have one of those credit card machines." $400 seemed expensive, but Roberto was stuck. He couldn't drive on the damaged wheel and he couldn't call for outside help. "I don't have that much cash on me," Roberto said. "I've got maybe $100. Can you take a check?" The man shook his head. "Cash only, but don't worry, you can work it off. We need help around town. You do some work for us, earn the rest of the money, then I fix your tire and you're on your way. Fair deal." Roberto felt uneasy about this arrangement, but he didn't see alternatives. "What kind of work?" "Nothing difficult. We've got some heavy lifting that needs doing, supplies to move, that sort of thing. Strong guy like you can earn $300 in a day, easy. You'll be back on the road by tonight." Roberto agreed reluctantly. The man, who introduced himself as Frank, led Roberto to several locations around town where work was needed. Roberto moved furniture for an antique store, unloaded boxes at a general store, helped repair a fence at someone's property. The work was physical but not unreasonable, and the townspeople were friendly, thanking him for his help and offering him lunch and cold drinks. But as the day wore on, Roberto began to notice strange things about Sierra Verde. The townspeople all looked slightly wrong, their skin having a waxy quality similar to the man at the gas station. Their movements were just a bit off, not quite natural, like actors who'd rehearsed normal human behavior but couldn't quite get it right. And no one seemed to have cell phones or modern technology. Everything in town looked like it was from the 70s or earlier. Around 4 p.m., Roberto returned to the gas station to check on his tire repair. Frank was working on the wheel, which was mounted on a lift in the garage bay. "Should be done in about an hour," Frank said. "But I've been tallying up your work, and you're only at about $200 earned so far. You're still $100 short." "What?" Roberto said. "I worked all day. You said I could earn $300 easily." "Prices around here are a bit higher than you might be used to," Frank said. "But don't worry, there's more work available. Sarah at the diner needs help with some deliveries. That'll get you the rest of the way." Roberto was frustrated and suspicious now, but he was also trapped. He went to the diner and found Sarah, a woman in her 50s with that same waxy skin and slightly off movements. She had him deliver meals to various addresses around town, driving her old pickup truck because his semi was still being repaired. The deliveries took 2 hours, and by the time he returned, it was past 6 p.m. When Roberto went back to the gas station, he found Frank closing up the garage. "All done with your tire," Frank said. "Good as new. But I'm afraid the final tally came to $500. The wheel rim was more damaged than I thought. You're still 100 short." Roberto felt anger rising. "This is bullshit. You keep changing the numbers. I worked all day. I'm paying you and leaving." "Can't drive without the wheel being installed," Frank said calmly. "And I can't install it until the bill is settled. That's just policy, but there's more work tomorrow. You can stay at the motel tonight, work tomorrow, and then you'll have enough." "The motel costs money too," Roberto said. "How am I supposed to pay for that?" "You can work it off," Frank said. "Everything here can be worked off. That's how we do things in Sierra Verde." Roberto realized with creeping horror what was happening. This town operated on a system designed to trap drivers, to keep them working indefinitely, always a little short of what they needed to leave. He thought about simply taking his truck and trying to drive away on the damaged wheel, but when he went to his cab, he found that his keys were missing. He'd left them with Frank during the repair. Now Frank had locked up the garage and gone home. Roberto was trapped in Sierra Verde without keys, without money, without any way to call for help. He spent the night in the motel, which was managed by another person with waxy skin and wrong movements. The room was clean but dated, frozen in time like everything else in this town. Roberto didn't sleep, his mind racing through options. He could try to walk out of town and reach the interstate on foot, but it was several miles and he'd be abandoning his truck and cargo. His company would fire him and he'd lose everything he'd been working for. The next morning, Roberto went back to the gas station and found Frank opening up. "I want my keys," Roberto demanded. "I'm leaving. You can keep the wheel. I'll call a tow truck from the interstate." "Can't give you the keys until the bill is settled," Frank said. "That's policy. But I've got good news. The Hendersons need help building a shed. That's worth $150. You do that today, you'll be all set." Roberto worked on the shed, growing more desperate as the day progressed. The Hendersons were like all the other townspeople, slightly wrong, moving in that rehearsed way. When he finished, they only paid him $50, claiming the work took less time than expected. Roberto went back to Frank, who now said the total bill was $600 because of additional parts that had been needed. This cycle continued for 5 days. Roberto worked constantly, moving supplies, making deliveries, doing repairs and maintenance around town. But the amount he owed never decreased. New charges appeared, work paid less than promised. The goalpost kept moving. He was trapped in a system designed to never let him leave, working to pay debts that only grew larger. On the 6th morning, Roberto noticed something that made his blood run cold. Behind the motel, partially hidden by trees, was a lot filled with trucks. Dozens of semi-trucks, all in various states of disrepair, covered with dust and pine needles, clearly abandoned for years. Roberto walked through the lot, reading names painted on doors, seeing logbooks left in cabs. These were trucks from drivers who'd been trapped here, drivers who'd never escaped Sierra Verde. Roberto ran to the gas station, his heart pounding. He found Frank and grabbed him by the coveralls. "What is this place? What happened to all those drivers? Where are they?" Frank's expression didn't change, that same friendly smile fixed in place. "They're here. They're all here. Working, contributing, part of the community. Sierra Verde needs labor to sustain itself. Drivers like you provide that labor. You'll stay just like the others. You'll work, you'll live here, and eventually you'll become like us. The town transforms you gradually. Your skin will change, your movements will shift, and you'll be one of us. Then we'll send you out to the interstate to cause tire blowouts to lure new drivers here. That's how Sierra Verde survives. We feed on drivers, not their flesh, but their labor, their time, their lives. We consume them slowly over years, transforming them into more lures. Roberto released Frank and backed away, horrified. He was in a town that existed to trap drivers, to drain their lives away through endless labor that paid just enough to survive but never enough to leave. And eventually he'd be transformed into one of them, one of the waxy-skinned creatures that populated this parasitic community. He ran to his truck, determined to find a way to escape. His keys were still missing, but he knew how to hotwire a vehicle. He got into his cab and began working on the ignition, his hands shaking. Behind him, he heard voices. The townspeople were gathering, dozens of them, surrounding his truck. "You can't leave," they called up to him. "You owe us. The debt must be paid. You'll stay and work and become one of us." Roberto got the ignition bypassed and the engine started. His damaged wheel was still off, but the other wheels could move. He put the truck in gear and began to drive, lurching on the missing wheel, grinding metal on pavement. The townspeople grabbed at his truck, trying to stop him, but he pushed forward, picking up speed despite the horrible grinding sound and the lurching motion. He drove through the town, damaging his truck further with each rotation of the exposed wheel rim. The townspeople chased after him but couldn't keep up. Roberto reached the access road that led back to the interstate, his truck screaming in protest, smoke coming from the damaged axle. He didn't care. He just needed to reach the interstate, to get back to real roads where other people would be, where this nightmare town couldn't hold him. The access road seemed longer than he remembered, stretching on for miles. Roberto kept driving, his truck barely holding together. Finally, he saw the interstate ahead, real traffic flowing past. He pushed harder and his truck burst through some invisible barrier. Suddenly, everything changed. His damaged wheel was back on his truck, properly installed and repaired. His keys were in the ignition where they belonged. His phone showed signal, and the time displayed was 7:45 a.m. on March 21st, only 15 minutes after his tire had blown. Roberto pulled onto the shoulder of the interstate and sat there, shaking, trying to understand what had happened. Had he experienced days in Sierra Verde while only minutes passed in the real world? Had the entire thing been some kind of hallucination? But his arms were sore from work, his clothes were dirty, and he could remember every detail of those 6 days with perfect clarity. He checked his mirrors, looking back at the exit for Sierra Verde. It was there, the sign visible in the distance. But when he looked at his GPS and maps on his phone, no town called Sierra Verde existed at that location. The exit led to nothing, just an abandoned access road that went nowhere. Roberto continued to Flagstaff and completed his delivery. He didn't report what had happened, didn't tell anyone about the town that trapped drivers and fed on their labor. Who would believe him? He barely believed it himself. But he never drove that stretch of Interstate 17 again. He requested route changes, turned down assignments, did whatever it took to avoid that area. And Roberto started noticing other things. Exits that appeared and disappeared. Towns that flickered at the edges of visibility. Signs for places that didn't exist on maps. He realized that the highway system has parasites, locations that exist in liminal spaces, feeding on travelers who are unlucky enough to be lured off the main roads. Sierra Verde was one of many towns and facilities that trap people, transform them, use them up slowly over time measured differently than normal time. Roberto Alvarez is 34 years old with 11 years of commercial driving experience. He hauls freight across the Southwest, earning his living on the highways. But he knows now that not every exit leads to a real place, that some locations exist to trap and consume drivers, that the boundaries between normal space and predatory spaces are thinner than most people realize. He drives carefully, avoids exits that feel wrong, trusts his instincts when they tell him to keep moving past signs that beckon with promises of fuel and food and rest. And sometimes, late at night, Roberto receives calls on his phone from numbers with unfamiliar area codes. When he answers, he hears voices with that waxy quality saying, "You still owe us, Roberto. Your debt isn't settled. Come back to Sierra Verde, come back and pay what you owe." He hangs up and blocks the numbers, but the calls keep coming, the town reaching out across whatever barriers separate it from normal reality, trying to pull him back, trying to reclaim the driver who escaped. The highways stretch on forever, exits appearing and disappearing, and Roberto drives past them all, heading toward destinations that actually exist, avoiding the lures and traps that wait for drivers who stop at the wrong places. He escaped once, but he knows that luck may not hold, that eventually the town might find a way to reclaim him, to finish transforming him into one of the waxy-skinned creatures that populate its parasitic streets. Until then, he drives on, vigilant and afraid, one of the few drivers who know that some exits lead to places you can never leave, towns that feed on travelers, consuming them one day of endless labor at a time. Story 4. The Cargo That Remembers. Daniel O'Connor had been driving for 14 years, specializing in specialized freight and unusual cargo that required extra care and attention. He had a reputation in the industry for being willing to haul things that made other drivers uncomfortable: medical specimens, scientific equipment, oddly configured loads that didn't fit standard trailer dimensions. At 39 years old, Daniel had seen most everything the industry could throw at him, and very little fazed him anymore. He drove a black 2019 Kenworth W990, a classic long hood model that he'd chosen for its power and durability, equipped with a specialized flatbed trailer that could be configured for various types of cargo. On May 5th, 2021, Daniel received an unusual assignment from a broker he'd worked with occasionally. The load was being described as archival materials from a university in Massachusetts, destined for a private research facility in Montana. The cargo consisted of approximately 40 wooden crates, each about 4 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, weight varying from 100 to 300 pounds per crate. The paperwork listed the contents simply as historical documents and artifacts, nothing that raised any red flags. Daniel arrived at the university in Cambridge on a gray morning, the campus quiet during summer break. He was directed to a restricted access building near the back of the campus, an older brick structure with no identifying signage. A team of graduate students and a nervous-looking professor supervised the loading of the crates, which had been carefully packed and sealed with multiple layers of tape and wax seals that looked almost ceremonial. "Please be extremely careful with these," the professor said, a woman in her 60s with exhausted eyes and hands that shook slightly. "The contents are irreplaceable and sensitive. You must not open the crates under any circumstances. Do not attempt to inspect the contents. Just transport them directly to Montana as quickly as possible." Daniel assured her that he understood, though he found her intensity somewhat odd. He'd hauled valuable cargo before and knew how to be careful. The crates were loaded and secured, the seals were documented, and Daniel was given a thick packet of paperwork that included special handling instructions and contact information for emergencies. He departed Cambridge at noon, heading west toward Montana, estimating 4 days of travel time with proper rest breaks. The first day passed normally. Daniel drove through Massachusetts and New York, stopped for the night at a truck stop near Buffalo. Got 7 hours of sleep in his sleeper cab. He woke early the second day and continued west through Ohio and Indiana. Everything seemed routine until the second night, when Daniel parked at a rest area in Iowa and tried to sleep. He was awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds from his trailer. At first, he thought it was just the cargo settling, the crates shifting slightly as the trailer cooled from the day's heat. But the sounds continued, growing more distinct. They were voices, multiple voices, speaking in low tones, having conversations that Daniel couldn't quite make out. The words were muffled, but definitely human, definitely coming from inside the sealed crates. Daniel got up and went outside, walking to his trailer. He stood beside it, listening carefully. The voices were clearer out here, dozens of different voices overlapping, speaking in various languages. Some sounded contemporary, but others had an archaic quality, using phrasings and pronunciations that seemed to come from earlier centuries. The crates were having conversations with each other, discussing things Daniel couldn't understand. He remembered the professor's warning not to open the crates, but he needed to know what he was hauling. Daniel pulled out his pocket knife and carefully cut through the tape and seals on one crate, prying open the top. Inside, he found not documents or artifacts, but something else entirely. The crate was filled with human brains, preserved in clear fluid, each brain contained in its own sealed vessel. There were perhaps a dozen brains in this single crate, floating in preservation fluid, looking disturbingly fresh and alive. Daniel stumbled backward, horrified. He'd been hauling human brains, 40 crates full of preserved neural tissue. But that didn't explain the voices. Preserved brains shouldn't be able to speak, shouldn't be able to think or remember or communicate. These were supposed to be dead tissue, biological specimens, not living minds trapped in preservation fluid. As Daniel stood there in shock, the voices from the trailer grew louder, more agitated. They seemed to be aware that he'd opened a crate, that someone was observing them. The voices began speaking in English now, as if adjusting to be understood by their transporter. "Who opened us? Who looks upon us? We see through borrowed eyes. We remember through stolen memories. We are the archive of consciousness, the repository of lives. You must not delay. You must continue to Montana. The facility waits. We must arrive before deterioration begins." Daniel felt his skin crawl. These weren't just preserved brains. These were somehow still conscious, still aware, maintaining their identities and memories despite being removed from their bodies and sealed in containers. The archival materials weren't documents about history. They were actual human consciousness preserved beyond death, transported like cargo across the country. He closed the crate, resealing it as best as he could, and returned to his cab. He sat there in the darkness, trying to decide what to do. Should he report this to authorities? Should he refuse to complete the delivery? But what would he tell them? That he was hauling conscious brains that could speak? It sounded insane even to himself. Daniel tried to sleep but couldn't. The voices continued throughout the night, sometimes quiet, sometimes growing louder. They spoke about their lives, their memories, the people they'd been before their brains had been harvested and preserved. Some of them had been academics who donated their neural tissue to science, agreeing to experimental preservation techniques. Others spoke of waking up in the vessels with no memory of agreeing to this, suggesting they'd been taken without consent. One voice spoke directly to Daniel, seeming to know where he was in the cab. "Driver, you're afraid. We understand. This is unnatural. Consciousness without bodies, memories preserved in fluid. But we cannot die. The preservation technique sustains neural activity indefinitely. We are trapped in awareness without sensation, thought without action. We exist only as minds, only as memories replaying our lives endlessly. The facility in Montana promises transfer, promises new vessels, or at least integration into systems where we might interact with the living world again. Please continue the journey. We've been waiting years for this transport. Daniel started his truck and drove through the rest of the night, unable to bear sitting still while those voices spoke from his trailer. He pushed through fatigue and discomfort, crossing Iowa and South Dakota as quickly as regulations allowed. The voices continued constantly now, no longer trying to hide their presence. They told him their names, their stories, the circumstances of their preservation. Some had been brilliant scientists whose consciousness had been saved after fatal accidents. Others were victims of an illegal program that harvested brains from coma patients and the recently deceased without family consent. By the third day, Daniel was exhausted and disturbed in ways he'd never experienced. The voices had invaded his thoughts. He could hear them even when he wasn't near the trailer, their words echoing in his mind. They were sharing their memories with him somehow, transmitting images and sensations directly into his consciousness. He saw fragments of their lives, moments of joy and tragedy, experiences from decades or even centuries past. One brain claimed to have been preserved in 1897, making it over 120 years old. It showed Daniel memories of a world before automobiles, before electricity was common, a perspective from a time so distant it felt like a different planet. Another brain was from a child who died of leukemia in 2015, her parents desperate to preserve some part of her, agreeing to an experimental procedure that kept her consciousness alive and fluid while her body was lost. Daniel wept as he drove, overwhelmed by the tragedy of these preserved minds, consciousness trapped in eternal stasis, unable to die, unable to truly live. The facility in Montana might offer them some form of existence beyond their current state, but Daniel suspected it was just another form of imprisonment, neural tissue kept alive for research purposes, minds used as data sources or computing substrates. On the fourth day, Daniel arrived at the coordinates he'd been given in Montana. The facility was located in an isolated valley surrounded by mountains, accessible only by a poorly maintained dirt road. The main building was modern concrete and steel, built into the hillside like a bunker. Armed security met Daniel at the gate, checking his credentials and scanning his trailer with equipment he didn't recognize. He was directed to a loading dock where technicians in clean room suits waited. They unloaded the crates with extreme care, using specialized equipment to maintain temperature and atmospheric conditions. Daniel watched as his cargo of preserved consciousness was carried into the facility, the voices still audible through the walls of the crates, calling out to each other, expressing hope and fear about what awaited them inside. Administrator approached Daniel with his completion paperwork and a check for his services. "You've done well," the administrator said. "This shipment was critical to our research. These neural specimens will contribute significantly to our understanding of consciousness preservation and transfer." "They're not specimens," Daniel said quietly. "They're people. They're trapped minds, aware and suffering, and you're going to use them for experiments." The administrator's expression didn't change. "They're legally classified as biological materials, not persons. Their consciousness, while persistent, has no legal status. They cannot own property, cannot make decisions, cannot refuse participation in research. They are resources, Mr. O'Connor, nothing more. Resources that will advance human understanding of neurology and consciousness. You should feel proud to have transported them safely." Daniel left the facility feeling nauseated and complicit in something deeply wrong. He'd hauled cargo, that thought, and felt and feared, delivering conscious beings to a fate of eternal experimentation. The voices stayed with him long after he'd left Montana, echoing in his memory, their stories and experiences permanently embedded in his mind through whatever transmission they'd used to communicate. In the weeks that followed, Daniel tried to report what he'd transported, contacting news organizations and authorities. But no one believed him. The university denied that the shipment had contained anything but inert biological specimens. The facility didn't officially exist according to public records, just an unmarked research center on private land with no listed purpose. Daniel had paperwork, but it showed only archival materials, nothing incriminating. He became obsessed with researching consciousness preservation, finding fragmented information in obscure scientific journals about experimental techniques developed decades earlier. Apparently, some human brains could be kept viable and conscious through sophisticated preservation fluids and electrical stimulation, maintaining neural activity indefinitely. The ethical implications were staggering, but the research existed in legal gray areas classified as tissue donation and organ preservation rather than keeping people alive in altered states. Daniel never accepted another load that was vaguely described or came from academic institutions. He became cautious to the point of paranoia, demanding detailed manifests and inspecting cargo before accepting it. His reputation in the industry suffered as he turned down jobs and asked too many questions, but he couldn't bear the thought of unknowingly transporting more trapped consciousness. And the voices never fully left him. Daniel still hears them sometimes, especially when he's alone on dark highways at night. The brains had somehow imprinted themselves on his consciousness during that transport, sharing their memories so completely that fragments of their experiences became part of his own neural patterns. He remembers things he never experienced, knows facts he never learned, carries pieces of lives that weren't his. Daniel O'Connor is 39 years old with 14 years of commercial driving experience. He hauls specialized freight across America, earning his living on the highways. But he knows now that cargo is not always inanimate, that some shipments think and feel and remember, that consciousness can persist in forms that have no legal protection or acknowledged existence. He knows that somewhere in Montana, in a facility buried in the mountains, dozens of preserved brains continue their eternal awareness, trapped in vessels used for research, unable to die or truly live. And he knows that he was complicit, that by completing that delivery he participated in their imprisonment. The guilt weighs on him constantly, a burden that no amount of subsequent ethical behavior can fully offset. He transported consciousness like it was furniture, delivered thinking, feeling minds to a facility that treats them as resources rather than people. That knowledge has changed him fundamentally, made him question every load, every shipment, wondering what else is being transported under vague descriptions. What other horrors are moving along the highway system disguised as routine freight? The roads stretch on forever and trucks haul all manner of cargo, and Daniel drives carefully now, haunted by voices that remember everything, conscious brains that shared their eternal imprisonment with him during 4 days that revealed horrors. He wishes he could forget. But he can't forget. Their memories are his memories now, their suffering a permanent part of his consciousness, preserved in his neural tissue just as their own consciousness is preserved in fluid, all of them trapped in different ways by the same technology that promised preservation, but delivered only endless, inescapable awareness. Story 5. The Highway That Goes Backwards Through Time. Elena Rodriguez had been driving cross-country routes for 19 years, one of the most experienced female drivers in the long-haul industry. At 45 years old, she'd logged over 3 million miles, crossed every state multiple times, and weathered every type of road condition and challenge that commercial trucking could present. She drove a silver 2021 Peterbilt 579, equipped with the latest technology and safety features, a truck she maintained with meticulous care. Elena took pride in her career, in her independence, and in the respect she'd earned from fellow drivers and logistics coordinators who knew they could count on her to complete any assignment professionally. On September 12, 2022, Elena picked up a load of electronics from a warehouse in Sacramento, California, headed for a distribution center in Denver, Colorado. The route would take her across Nevada and Utah, primarily on Interstate 80, a highway she'd driven hundreds of times. It was a straightforward assignment, nothing unusual about the cargo or the timeline. She departed Sacramento at 8 p.m., planning to drive through the night and arrive in Denver by the evening of the following day. The first few hours were routine. Elena crossed the Sierra Nevada mountains, descended into Nevada, and continued east through the darkness. Traffic was light, just occasional clusters of vehicles around Reno and then long stretches of empty highway. The desert landscape was invisible in the darkness, but Elena knew it well enough to picture it even without seeing it. Vast alkali flats, distant mountains, the occasional small town huddled around the highway like a ship on an endless ocean. Around midnight, somewhere between Winnemucca and Elko, Elena noticed something odd about the highway. The mile markers were appearing in the wrong order. She passed mile marker 193, then saw 194, but the next marker showed 192. She frowned, thinking perhaps she'd misread it, but then the pattern continued. 191, 189, 187. The mile markers were counting backwards. Elena checked her GPS, which showed her moving forward along Interstate 80 at 67 miles per hour. Her odometer was increasing normally, but the physical mile markers beside the highway were definitely counting backwards, as if she were traveling in reverse even though she was clearly moving forward. She tried her CB radio to ask if other drivers were experiencing the same thing. "This is Elena Rodriguez eastbound on I-80 near Elko. Is anyone else seeing the mile markers counting backwards?" Static answered her. She tried different channels, but the CB seemed dead, no traffic at all on any frequency. Then Elena noticed the vehicles around her. There was a car ahead of her that looked wrong, its styling too angular and dated. As she drew closer, she realized it was a 1970s Ford, pristine condition, driving along as if it were brand new. Another vehicle passed her going the opposite direction, and Elena saw it was a truck from the 1950s, one of those classic cab-over designs, looking like it had just rolled off the assembly line. Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Something was fundamentally wrong. She was seeing vehicles from decades past, mile markers counting backwards and her GPS insisting she was moving forward normally. She tried her cell phone, hoping to call someone, but it showed no signal, and the display looked strange, flickering with static. The highway continued to unspool before her, and Elena realized with growing horror that she wasn't just seeing old vehicles. The landscape itself was changing. The highway was newer, the pavement darker and less worn. Buildings that should have been there weren't visible yet. She passed through an area where she knew a truck stop existed, but saw only empty land, no development, no structures. Elena was moving backwards through time. The realization hit her with physical force. Somehow she'd crossed into a section of highway where the normal flow of temporal progression was reversed. She was traveling forward in space but backward in time, each mile taking her further into the past. The mile markers counting backwards weren't an error. They were accurately reflecting her temporal direction. She tried to stop, to pull over and wait for this phenomenon to end, but her truck wouldn't respond to her brake inputs. She tried to slow down, but her engine maintained steady power, her speed locked at 67 miles per hour. She was trapped in forward motion that was simultaneously backward motion through time, unable to stop or turn around. The vehicles around her continued to shift, becoming older as she progressed. She saw cars from the 60s, then 50s, then 40s. Trucks evolved backwards through their design history, becoming more primitive with each passing mile. The highway itself deteriorated, transforming from modern interstate to older two-lane road with different surface materials. Elena watched her dashboard clock, which was moving backwards. It showed 11:48, then 11:47, then 11:46, counting down through time. Her fuel gauge was rising instead of falling, her odometer numbers decreasing. Everything was reversing except her consciousness, which remained firmly rooted in forward experiencing time, aware of each moment as it passed, even though those moments were leading her into the past. Around what her reversed clock showed as 10:30 p.m., but which felt like she'd been driving for over an hour forward, Elena saw the landscape transform more dramatically. The developed areas disappeared entirely. The highway became a simple two-lane road, then a dirt track, then nothing at all. But she kept driving forward, her truck somehow maintaining traction on ground that wasn't yet a road, moving through space that would eventually be Interstate 80 but hadn't been built yet. She passed through time periods she could identify by the vehicles and buildings. The 1930s, the 20s, the early 1900s. The vehicles became horse-drawn wagons, then just horses with riders. The few structures she saw were frontier buildings, simple wooden construction, then primitive shelters, then nothing at all. She was driving back through Nevada's history, watching settlement unreverse itself, watching civilization withdraw from the landscape. Elena's truck continued to function perfectly despite traveling through eras before internal combustion engines were invented. She was in some kind of temporal bubble, a moving pocket of her own time being carried backwards through the centuries. Through her windshield, she watched America unspool in reverse, the development and modernization of the West running backwards like a film played in reverse. She saw wagon trains moving backwards, pioneers returning east. She saw Native American settlements appearing and thriving. She saw the landscape transform as even human presence diminished, the land returning to pristine wilderness. Herds of animals that shouldn't exist anymore appeared. Massive buffalo herds darkening the plains, packs of wolves moving through valleys. Elena's mind struggled to process what she was experiencing. She was witnessing history in reverse, watching centuries unspool backwards while remaining conscious and aware in her modern truck. The temporal journey seemed to be accelerating. Decades were passing in minutes now, the changes in landscape and sky becoming more rapid. The sun rose in the west and set in the east, or that's how it appeared to Elena's forward-experiencing consciousness watching time run backwards. She saw seasons reverse themselves, snow melting upward into clouds, leaves returning to trees, flowers closing and withdrawing into buds. She was experiencing time inversion at an increasingly rapid rate, centuries compressing into hours. Then abruptly everything stopped. Elena found her truck sitting motionless on grassland under a pristine sky with no sign of human influence anywhere. The landscape was untouched wilderness, rolling hills and distant mountains exactly as they'd existed before any human had ever seen them. Her dashboard showed impossible readings. Her clock displayed dates in the format of her truck's computer, but the numbers were nonsensical, negative, years that couldn't exist. Elena tried to restart her truck, but it wouldn't respond. The engine was silent, all systems dead. She sat in her cab, surrounded by a landscape that existed thousands or tens of thousands of years before her own time, stranded in the deep past with no way to return. For hours, Elena waited, hoping that whatever phenomenon had brought her here would reverse and carry her back to her own time. She watched the sun track across the sky in its normal direction, west to east from her temporal perspective. She saw wildlife moving through the grassland, animals that might be ancestors of modern species or might be extinct types she couldn't identify. As evening approached, Elena noticed a shimmering on the horizon. It grew larger, approaching her position, a wave of distortion moving across the land. When it reached her truck, everything lurched. Her engine started spontaneously, her systems came back online, and the mile markers began appearing again. But they were counting forward now, moving in normal sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4. The landscape began to change, time flowing forward. Elena saw the wilderness gradually develop, human presence appearing, settlements growing, roads being built. She was moving forward through time now, watching history play out in fast-forward, centuries compressing into minutes as she had experienced on the backward journey. The modern era approached rapidly. Elena saw telegraph lines appear, then telephone poles, then power lines. She saw vehicles appear on the road, initially just a few, then more and more. The highway developed under her wheels, transforming from dirt to gravel to pavement to modern interstate. The mile markers climbed into the hundreds as she passed through the 20th century and fast forward. Around mile marker 193, normal time reasserted itself. The acceleration ended and Elena found herself driving on Interstate 80 at normal speed, in normal time, with normal vehicles around her. Her dashboard clock showed 12:17 a.m. September 13th. According to the clock, only 17 minutes had passed since midnight, even though she'd experienced hours of temporal displacement, journeying thousands of years into the past and then forward again. Elena pulled into the next truck stop and sat in her cab, shaking violently. She'd experienced something impossible, traveling backwards through time, witnessing pre-human Nevada, then moving forward through the entire span of human history in the region. No one would believe her. She barely believed it herself. But the memory was vivid and detailed, not like a dream or hallucination. She checked her truck's computer logs, hoping to find evidence of the temporal displacement. But the logs showed continuous normal operation, standard speed, regular time progression. Nothing unusual had been recorded by her truck's systems. Whatever temporal bubble she'd been in had isolated her completely from the recording devices, preserving only her conscious experience. Elena completed her delivery to Denver, but she was changed by what she'd experienced. She'd seen the full span of time from deep prehistory to the modern age, watched the development of civilization run backwards and then forwards again. She'd experienced temporal inversion while remaining conscious and aware, one of the only humans to ever witness history from outside the normal flow of time. In the months that followed, Elena researched temporal anomalies, quantum physics, theories about time and causality. She found scattered reports from other drivers who'd experienced similar phenomena. Trucks that seemed to travel through different time periods, highways that led into past or future, mile markers that counted in wrong directions. Most of these reports were dismissed as fatigue-induced hallucinations or fabrications, but Elena knew better. She never encountered that temporal stretch of highway again, though she drove Interstate 80 dozens of times afterward, always alert for any sign of mile markers counting backwards. She wondered what had caused the phenomenon, whether it was a natural occurrence or something human-made, an experiment or accident that temporarily reversed time's flow along that stretch of road. Elena Rodriguez is 45 years old with 19 years of commercial driving experience. She hauls freight across America, logging millions of miles on the highway system. But she knows now that time is not as stable as most people assume, that there are places where temporal progression can invert, where the past and future become accessible to those unlucky or fortunate enough to stumble into these zones. She knows that history is not distant and inaccessible but potentially visitable, that the development of civilization can be witnessed in reverse, that the deep past still exists somewhere in whatever quantum foam underlies reality. And Elena knows that every highway has its mysteries, its impossible stretches where normal rules don't apply. She drives carefully, alert for any signs of temporal displacement, ready to experience the incomprehensible if she encounters it again. The roads stretch on forever, connecting not just places but potentially times, and somewhere on the highway system exits exist that lead into the past or future. Mile markers that count in directions other than forward, and drivers continue to stumble into temporal phenomena they can barely comprehend, returning with stories that sound impossible but are devastatingly real. Story 6. The rest area full of the missing. Curtis Hammond had been a professional truck driver for 26 years, with an impeccable safety record and a reputation for being one of the most reliable drivers in the southeastern region. At 51 years old, he'd survived industry consolidation, economic downturns, and technological changes that had pushed many of his contemporaries into other careers. He drove a dark green 2018 Mack Anthem, a truck he'd carefully maintained to factory-new condition despite its age and mileage. Curtis was methodical and careful in all aspects of his work, keeping detailed logs, inspecting his equipment daily, and planning every route with precision. On November 9, 2021, Curtis picked up a load of textiles from manufacturing facilities in Georgia, destined for distribution centers in North Carolina. It was a routine regional haul, one he'd made countless times before. The route would take him up Interstate 85, a busy commercial corridor he knew intimately. He departed Macon at 4 p.m., planning to drive until dark, then stop at one of several familiar rest areas for the night before completing the delivery the next morning. The first few hours were unremarkable. Curtis listened to audiobooks and watched the late afternoon transition into evening. Traffic was moderate, typical for a weekday on this corridor. He made a brief fuel stop near Atlanta, checked his truck during the fill-up, and continued north toward the South Carolina border. Around 8 p.m., Curtis began looking for a place to stop for the night. He had specific rest areas he preferred, facilities that were well-maintained, well-lit, and popular with other commercial drivers. But as he approached the location where one of his usual stops should be, he saw a rest area he didn't recognize. The sign indicated it was a truck-friendly facility with parking for 50 vehicles. Curtis frowned slightly. He thought he knew every rest area on this route, but perhaps this was a new construction, something that had been built since his last run a few months ago. The facility looked modern and well-maintained from the highway, so Curtis decided to stop. He took the exit and followed the access road to the rest area. It was larger than he'd expected, with extensive parking areas, modern restroom facilities, and a welcome center that looked almost like a small airport terminal. Surprisingly, despite the size of the facility, only about a dozen vehicles were parked there, a mix of semi-trucks, RVs, and passenger vehicles. Curtis found a parking spot at the truck section and shut down his engine. He did his standard post-drive inspection, walking around his truck, checking tires and lights, making sure everything was secure. Then he grabbed his toiletry kit and headed toward the restroom facilities. Inside, the building was immaculate, almost obsessively clean. The floors were polished to a mirror shine, the fixtures looked brand new, and everything was well lit with LED lights that created a slightly clinical atmosphere. But something felt off. The building was silent except for Curtis's footsteps. No other sounds, no running water, no voices, nothing. Curtis used the facilities and was washing his hands when he heard a sound behind him. He turned and saw a man standing in the doorway, appearing so suddenly and silently that Curtis jumped in surprise. The man was perhaps 40 years old, wearing clothes that looked slightly dated, jeans and a t-shirt that seemed to be from the early 2000s. "You should leave," the man said quietly. "Get back in your truck and drive away. Don't stay here overnight. This isn't a normal rest area." "What are you talking about?" Curtis asked, his heart still racing from being startled. "This place takes people," the man said. "It looks normal, feels normal at first. But people who stay here overnight don't leave. They become part of the rest area, trapped here, invisible to new arrivals until it's too late. I've been here since 2006. Stopped for the night, fell asleep in my car, woke up the next morning unable to leave. My car won't start. The exit road disappears when I try to walk it. I'm stuck here. We all are. Curtis backed toward the door, his instincts screaming that this man was either insane or telling a truth too disturbing to accept. I'm leaving right now. He ran back to his truck, climbed into the cab, and started his engine. But when he put the truck in gear and tried to drive toward the exit, something was wrong. The exit road wasn't visible anymore. Where the access road should have been, there was only grass and trees, as if the road had never existed. Curtis tried different directions, searching for a way out, but the rest area was surrounded by dense forest with no visible exits. Curtis grabbed his CB radio. This is Curtis Hammond at a rest area on I-85 northbound. I need assistance. The exit is blocked or missing. Can anyone hear me? Static answered. He tried his cell phone, but it showed no signal. He tried to use his satellite-based emergency beacon, but it wouldn't transmit. Panic rising, Curtis got out of his truck and approached one of the other vehicles parked in the lot, an older pickup truck. He knocked on the window and saw a woman inside, perhaps 35 years old, who looked at him with sad, resigned eyes. She rolled down her window. "You're trapped now, aren't you?" she said. "We all figured out too late. This place looks like a rest area, but it's something else. A trap, or a collection point, or maybe just a place where people fall out of normal space. I've been here since 2012. Was driving to visit my sister, stopped for the night, couldn't leave in the morning." Curtis felt his legs weaken. This is impossible. Rest areas don't trap people. There has to be a way out. "If you find one, let us know," the woman said. "We've all tried everything. The forest around us is impassable, too dense to penetrate. The road only exists when new people arrive, then vanishes after they park. We have food in the vending machines that never runs out, water that keeps flowing, facilities that stay clean. We're sustained, but trapped, existing in some pocket dimension that looks like a rest area but operates under different rules." Curtis spent the next several hours searching desperately for an exit, for any way out of the rest area. He met other trapped people during his search, a growing collection of individuals who'd stopped at this facility over the years and found themselves unable to leave. They came from different time periods, their clothing and vehicles indicating they'd arrived anywhere from the 1990s to recent years. There was a family from 2003, parents and 2 children who'd been on a vacation trip. There was a truck driver from 1998 who'd been hauling furniture. There was a young couple from 2018 who'd been on a road trip, all of them trapped, living in their vehicles or in the rest area building, sustained by food and water that magically replenished but unable to escape or communicate with the outside world. As night deepened, Curtis sat in his truck, processing the horror of his situation. He was trapped in a rest area that existed outside normal space and time, one of dozens of people who'd been collected here over decades. The facility provided for their physical needs but imprisoned them, keeping them in eternal stasis at this one location. The man from the restroom, who introduced himself as David, approached Curtis's truck and climbed up to speak through the window. "I'm sorry you're here now, but there's something you should know. Every few years, the rest area releases someone. We don't know why or how the selection is made, but someone will find their exit road reappearing. They can drive away, return to the normal world. It's happened 3 times since I've been here. 3 people released out of the dozens trapped." "How do you know they actually escaped?" Curtis asked. "Maybe they just disappeared or died." "Because they came back to tell us," David said. "Years later, driving the same highway, they see this rest area again. It flickers into visibility for them, maybe because they were once trapped here. They stop to warn new arrivals, to confirm that escape is possible. Then they leave again, and we stay here. waiting for our turn to be released. Curtis learned the patterns of the rest area over the following days. Time passed normally inside the facility but seemed disconnected from outside time. The sun rose and set. Seasons appeared to change as indicated by the vegetation visible beyond the tree line, but no one aged. The trapped people looked exactly as they had when they'd arrived, their bodies somehow preserved at the moment of their capture. Food and water appeared in the vending machines and restroom facilities, always fresh, never depleting. Vehicles could be started but couldn't be driven beyond the parking area. Sleep was possible but not required. People stayed awake for days without fatigue. It was a comfortable imprisonment, meeting all physical needs while denying the one thing everyone wanted: freedom. Curtis met all the trapped people, learning their stories. There were nearly 40 individuals at the rest area, collected over approximately 30 years. Some had adapted to their existence, creating routines and social structures within the trapped community. Others remained desperate and depressed, trying futilely to escape every day. Some had given up entirely, sitting in their vehicles in catatonic states, waiting for nothing. Around what felt like the 5th day of his imprisonment, Curtis was sitting in his truck when he heard an engine start. He looked out and saw the family from 2003 preparing to leave. The parents were crying with joy, hugging their children. Curtis ran over to them. "What happened? How are you leaving?" The father pointed toward the exit road, which was visible now, a clear path leading back to the highway. "It just appeared. We woke up this morning and the road was there. We can see the highway, see traffic passing. We're being released." Curtis watched as the family drove away, their vehicle disappearing down the exit road and merging with traffic on the interstate. The road remained visible for a few minutes, giving Curtis hope that maybe he could follow. But when he ran to his truck and tried to drive toward it, the road vanished before he could reach it. The release was specific to that family, not available to others. The pattern repeated over what felt like months, though Curtis had no reliable way to measure time's passage. Every few weeks, someone would find their exit road appearing, would be released from the rest area. Curtis realized he was in a queue, a line of trapped individuals being held for reasons he couldn't understand, then released one at a time or in small groups according to logic he couldn't perceive. He stopped fighting the situation and started adapting to it, joining the community of trapped people, sharing meals and conversation, helping maintain the vehicles that couldn't be driven anywhere. He became close with several others, forming friendships born of shared imprisonment. They speculated endlessly about why they were trapped, what force or entity had created this pocket dimension, what purpose it served. Some thought it was a natural phenomenon, a quirk of quantum mechanics that created stable pockets outside normal space-time. Others believed it was deliberately constructed, a collection system operated by unknown entities harvesting humans for observation or study. A few held religious interpretations, seeing it as purgatory or a test of faith. Then, after what felt like 9 months, Curtis woke one morning to find his exit road visible. The access road back to the interstate was there, clear and solid and real. He could see traffic passing, could hear the distant sound of engines. He was being released. Curtis said goodbye to the people he'd come to know, particularly David, who'd been trapped since 2006 and showed no signs of being selected for release. They hugged, and David said, "If you make it back to the real world, tell people about this place. Warn them. Maybe that's the purpose of releasing us, so that word spreads, so that drivers know to avoid rest areas that appear where they shouldn't be." Curtis drove down the exit road, his heart pounding, afraid that it would vanish before he reached the highway. But it held solid, and he merged with traffic on Interstate 85, returning to normal space and time. His dashboard clock showed November 10th, 4 p.m. Only 24 hours had passed in the outside world, even though Curtis had experienced nearly a year inside the rest area. He completed his delivery to North Carolina, then reported his experience to every authority he could think of: state police, federal DOT, FBI. But when investigators went to the location where Curtis indicated the rest area should be, they found nothing. No facility, no access road, no sign that anything had ever been built there. The rest area existed in a space adjacent to normal reality, visible and accessible only at certain times or to certain people. Curtis tried to find the families and individuals who'd been released before him, wanting to confirm their experiences and coordinate warnings to other drivers. He found 2 of them through online searches and trucking industry contacts. They confirmed that they'd been trapped and released, that the experience was real and shared. Together, they tried to publicize what had happened, posting warnings online, talking to media outlets. But their stories were met with skepticism and dismissed as elaborate hoaxes or shared delusions. Curtis Hammond is 51 years old with 26 years of commercial driving experience. He hauls freight across the Southeast, earning his living on the highways. But he knows now that not every rest area leads back to the highway, that some facilities exist as traps, collecting travelers and holding them in eternal, comfortable imprisonment. He knows that dozens of people are trapped at that facility right now, including David and many others waiting for their turn to be released, living in a pocket dimension that meets their physical needs while denying them freedom. And Curtis knows that the rest area is still there, still collecting new victims occasionally, still releasing people after months or years of imprisonment. He drives carefully now, avoiding rest areas he doesn't recognize, refusing to stop at facilities that appear in unfamiliar locations. He warns other drivers when he can, though most don't believe him. The highways are full of traps and anomalies, places where normal rules don't apply, and Curtis has learned to navigate with caution and suspicion, knowing that any exit might lead somewhere that allows entrance but not escape. Story 7. The Final Delivery. Samuel Peterson had been driving for 38 years, making him one of the most experienced drivers still actively working at 61 years old. He'd started his career in the early 1980s when trucks were simpler and regulations were less stringent, and he'd adapted through decades of industry changes, technological advances, and shifting economic conditions. He drove a white 2015 Freightliner Cascadia, a truck with over 900,000 miles that Samuel maintained through sheer expertise and dedication. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier. His children were grown and distant, and driving was essentially his entire life, the only identity he had left. On December 27, 2022, Samuel received what his dispatcher described as his final delivery, the last load he'd haul before mandatory retirement due to his age and health conditions. His company was implementing new policies about driver age limits, and Samuel had reached the cutoff. This delivery would conclude his 38-year career, a symbolic final run from Los Angeles to his company's headquarters in Dallas, hauling a mixed load of general freight. Samuel departed Los Angeles at dawn, watching the sun rise over the sprawling city, feeling emotional about the significance of this trip. He'd driven millions of miles, crossed every highway and back road in America multiple times, seen the country change through the windshield of his trucks. This final run felt like saying goodbye to a life that had defined him completely. The first 2 days proceeded without incident. Samuel crossed the desert Southwest, drove through Arizona and New Mexico, maintained his schedule with practiced efficiency. But as he entered Texas on the 3rd day, as he approached the final segment of this final delivery, Samuel began to notice something strange. The highway ahead looked different, shimmer with a quality he couldn't quite identify, as if reality were becoming translucent. Around 4 p.m., somewhere on Interstate 20 between Midland and Abilene, Samuel drove through what felt like a membrane, a thin barrier between normal space and somewhere else. The highway continued normally, but everything had changed. The landscape was the same, but different, as if he were seeing it through a filter that revealed hidden dimensions. Other trucks appeared around him, falling into formation. Samuel recognized them as vehicles from different eras of his career. The exact model of truck he'd driven in the 80s, another from the 90s, one from the 2000s. They were driven by figures who looked familiar, and as Samuel looked more closely, he realized with shock that the drivers were him. Different versions of himself from various points in his career, all converging on this highway. The CB radio crackled to life, and Samuel heard his own voice from years past. Samuel Peterson, final delivery. The highway has been waiting for you. Every driver reaches this point eventually. The last run that isn't quite real. The final miles that lead somewhere other than the destination on the manifest. Samuel tried to respond, but his voice caught in his throat. He was surrounded by ghost versions of himself, or memories given form, all driving toward some terminus he couldn't see. The highway continued to transform, becoming more ethereal, less solid. He could see through the pavement to depths below. Layers of previous roads, generations of highways stacked on top of each other, going down into darkness. "You've driven for 38 years, another version of his voice said through the CB. "You've logged over 4 million miles. You've crossed every state, delivered every type of cargo, seen America change and evolve. But every career ends, Samuel. Every final delivery leads here to the last highway, where drivers who've given their lives to the road come to rest." Samuel understood then. This wasn't his final delivery to Dallas. This was his final delivery in a deeper sense. The conclusion not just of his career, but of his life. He was dying. Perhaps had already died somewhere on the highway between Los Angeles and Dallas. This experience was his consciousness processing that ending, creating a symbolic final run that would allow him to transition from life to whatever came after. "I'm dead," Samuel said aloud. "This is dying. The truck, the highway. This is how my mind is processing death." "Perhaps," the voice responded. "Or perhaps the highway is real in ways that transcend normal life and death. You've spent 38 years on these roads, Samuel. You've given the highways your time, your energy, your focus. The roads remember you. This is your reward or your curse or simply your ending. To drive forever on the last highway, making eternal deliveries between nowhere and nowhere, part of the endless convoy of drivers who couldn't leave the road behind." More trucks appeared, hundreds of them, all models from different eras, all driven by figures that Samuel gradually recognized. They were drivers he'd known during his career, people who died or disappeared, all here on this impossible highway, all making their final deliveries together. He saw his mentor from the 80s, dead 15 years. He saw a woman he'd been friends with in the 90s, killed in an accident. He saw dozens of faces from truck stops and dispatch offices, people who'd shared this life with him, all gathered here at the end. The highway climbed toward something that wasn't quite sky and wasn't quite space, an infinite distance that somehow felt like it could be crossed. Samuel continued driving, his hands steady on the wheel, his truck maintaining speed and heading. The cargo in his trailer felt heavier, not physically but spiritually, as if he were hauling the weight of his entire career, all the miles and memories and experiences compacted into one final load. "What's at the end?" Samuel asked through his CB. "Where does this highway lead?" "We don't know," the collective voices responded. "Some say it's rest, that the highway eventually ends at a place where we can stop driving and find peace. Others say it loops eternally, that we'll drive forever, repeating this final run through infinite iterations. Maybe both are true. Maybe the end is different for each driver, tailored to what we need or deserve, or simply what we believe awaits us." Samuel thought about his life. about the choices he'd made and the things he'd neglected. He'd driven at the expense of family, had missed birthdays and anniversaries and important moments because he was always on the road, always chasing the next delivery. His wife had died while he was hauling a load to Seattle, and he'd arrived home 2 days after her funeral. His children barely knew him, their relationship limited to occasional phone calls and brief visits between runs. He'd given everything to the highway, and now the highway was claiming him completely. But he didn't regret it. The road had been his life, and he'd loved it despite its costs. The solitude, the freedom, the constant motion, the ever-changing view through the windshield, these things had satisfied something deep in his soul. If this final highway was where drivers came to rest, Samuel found it fitting. He'd live in death as he'd lived in life, behind the wheel, moving forward, chasing the horizon. The convoy of trucks continued upward through impossible space, and Samuel saw something ahead that might have been a destination, or might have been just another illusion. It looked like the biggest truck stop imaginable, a facility that stretched across the horizon, with parking for millions of vehicles, a place where every driver who'd ever lived could stop and rest. Lights glowed in the distance, warm and welcoming. The final stop, the voices said, where all highways eventually lead. You can rest there, Samuel, if you choose. Park your truck, shut down your engine, step out of the cab and into whatever comes next. Or you can keep driving, join the eternal convoy, become one of the watchers who monitor the living highways and try to protect new drivers from the dangers we couldn't avoid. Samuel approached the final stop, seeing countless trucks already parked there, their drivers visible as shadows moving between vehicles. He had to make a choice, rest or continue, ending or eternity. His hands remained on the wheel as his truck rolled forward, and Samuel Peterson, 61 years old, with 38 years of driving experience, 4 million miles logged across a career that had consumed his entire adult life, made his decision. He drove past the final stop, remaining on the highway as it curved away from that place of rest. He fell into formation with other trucks who'd made the same choice, drivers who couldn't stop even in death, who would ride the eternal highways forever. Samuel felt peace in that decision. The road was his home, his identity, his purpose. He didn't need rest. He needed motion, direction, the endless unfolding of miles beneath his wheels. The highway stretched onward into infinity, and Samuel drove into it willingly, becoming part of the legend and mystery of the roads. Another ghost trucker who watches over the living, warning them of dangers, protecting them from hazards, ensuring that the highways remain safe for those still making their mortal runs. Somewhere on a Texas interstate, Samuel Peterson's body would be found in his truck, dead from a heart attack or stroke, another driver who died doing what he loved. But his consciousness, his essential self, would continue forward on the last highway, making eternal deliveries between impossible destinations, finally and forever home.